The first thing to disappear was the sound of children playing. Not all at once. Not in the way a candle is extinguished by a sudden breath. But slowly, the way warmth leaves a stone that has been removed from the fire, the way color drains from cloth left too long in the rain. One morning the village square held fewer voices. Then fewer still. The mud between the cottages, once churned and alive with the running of small feet, began to harden into something that felt less like ground and more like memory. The impression of a life that had recently been present and was now, quietly, withdrawing. And in that silence, if you stood very still near the edge of the barley field, you could hear the wind moving through stalks that should have been heavy with grain. But they were not heavy. They were thin and pale and wrong in the way that only a farmer can recognize wrongness, not with the mind, but with the body, with the hands, with the part of a person that has measured harvests since childhood and knows, without being told, when the earth has broken its agreement. They bent too easily, those stalks, like the spines of old men who had already surrendered to something they could not name. This is not a story that begins with a single catastrophe. There is no moment of ignition, no morning when the world announced itself as changed. The Great Famine, the hunger that would hollow out the heart of medieval Europe across nearly a decade, did not arrive the way plague arrives, sudden and named and terrible in its visibility. It crept in through the back of everything, through the weight of a loaf of bread that grew lighter each week, so gradually that a family might not notice until the day the loaf was simply no longer bread at all, but a disk of gritty paste that crumbled when touched and filled the stomach for less than an hour before the ache returned, deeper and more insistent than before. It crept in through the eyes of a mother standing at a wooden table in the gray light of early morning, measuring the last of the oat flour with trembling hands. She was not calculating whether there was enough. She had passed that question weeks ago. She was calculating something more precise and more terrible: how many days the insufficient amount could be made to last, and which days to sacrifice, and whether the children would understand that the smaller portion was not punishment but arithmetic. It crept in through the particular silence of a child who has learned not to ask for more. That silence, the silence of a hungry child who no longer asks, is one of the most devastating sounds a parent can learn to live inside. It means the child has accepted something. It means the world has already taught them a lesson that no child should need to know. In the early years of the 14th century, something broke in the sky above northern Europe. Across the low plains of Flanders and Picardy, where the soil was deep and the harvests had been generous for generations, the rains began in the spring of 1315 and simply did not relent. Not storms, nothing so dramatic as storms. Just a persistent, gray, saturating presence. A sky that had forgotten how to be anything other than the color of wet wool. A sun that appeared occasionally, weakly, like a visitor uncertain of its welcome, and then retreated again behind clouds that held their rain with the patient determination of something that had made up its mind. What should have been spring became a gray and waterlogged waiting. What should have been summer became a slow catastrophe conducted in silence. The grain that had been sown with hope into the soil of 1,000 villages sat in fields that were no longer fields but shallow lakes, the stalks yellowing and collapsing, the roots drinking until they drowned. And then the harvest came, or rather, the harvest did not come. In its place came rot. Black rot, soft rot, the kind that does not only spread through grain but through the people who depend on grain, through their plans and their preparations and their quiet faith that the world will continue to function as it has always functioned. Peasants who had spent their entire lives reading the land, who knew the smell of healthy soil and the color of well-ripened barley the way a reader knows the letters of the alphabet, knelt in the mud and pulled at stalks that dissolved in their fingers and knew something that no chronicle would record for a very long time: that the earth itself had turned indifferent. In a village somewhere along the Somme Valley, and it could have been any village, in any valley, in any of the dozens of kingdoms and lordships and ecclesiastical territories that made up the fractured body of medieval Europe, a woman stood at the edge of a ruined field and held in her hands the evidence of everything she had feared. She did not weep. There was no water to spare for weeping. She was perhaps 30 years old, though the years of labor and bearing children and the particular exhaustion of poverty had arranged themselves on her face in ways that made 30 look like 50. Her cloak was rough wool, undyed, darkened at the hem with mud that had dried and cracked and been re-wetted so many times it had become part of the fabric. It smelled of wet clay and wood smoke and something older beneath those smells, something that reminded her, strangely, of the inside of the village church, of the incense that the priest burned on feast days, of the particular cold that lived in stone walls regardless of the season, of endings. She stood for a long moment. She looked at what the field had given her, which was nothing. She looked at the sky, which offered no apology. She looked at the path back to the village, the same path she had walked every day of her life, the same ruts in the same earth, and she turned and began to walk it. She was preparing, as she walked, to say what she had already said 3 times before. What she would say again when she reached the door of her cottage and her husband looked up from whatever small and desperate task occupied his hands, and her children turned their faces toward her with the particular expression of people who already know the answer but cannot stop themselves from hoping to be wrong. There is nothing. We begin again with nothing. These are the words that medieval Europe spoke to itself in the years between 1315 and 1322, in 100 languages and 1,000 dialects, across a geography of suffering so vast that no single person could have comprehended its scale. But scale was never the point. Scale was what historians would argue about, centuries later, in warm rooms with full plates. The point, the human, unbearable, irreducible point, was always this. One family, one field, one woman walking home through the mud with empty hands, carrying in her body the knowledge that tomorrow would require something from her that she was not certain she still possessed. What she possessed, what all of them possessed, in village after village, in the cold years of a continent's long hunger, was something that had no name in the chronicles, no entry in the ledgers of lords, no place in the theology of the church that promised suffering had meaning. It was simply the decision, made again each morning in silence, to continue, to rise, to go to the field, to come back with nothing, and to say, not with hope, not yet, but with a stubbornness that was its own kind of sacred, we begin again. How they began again, what it cost them, what it broke in them, and what, against all reasonable expectation, it built, that is the story we have only just entered. Before the famine had a name, it had a smell. It arrived in the nose before it arrived in the stomach, before it arrived in the ledgers of lords or the margins of monastery records or the careful, devastated letters that bishops wrote to one another across the failing breadbasket of a continent. It was the smell of mildew on stored rye, that particular gray-green invasion that crept across the surface of grain sacks in the night, quiet as a rumor, and by morning had made the contents inedible or worse, dangerous. It was the sweetish, sickly exhalation of barley that had fermented in the wet before anyone could thresh it, a smell that had once, in better seasons, meant the pleasant sourness of ale being brewed, but now meant only waste, only loss, only the sickening conversion of sustenance into something the body could not use. And beneath those smells, underneath the rot and the wet and the turned grain, there was something else, something that rose from the fields themselves. Dark, earthy, almost devotional, the perfume of mushrooms spreading low across soil where wheat had once grown, pushing up through the mud in soft gray clusters, spreading outward like a congregation of the diminished, bowing silently before a God who had stopped attending. Those who survived the years between 1315 and 1322, the years that later scribes would cautiously, inadequately call the Great Famine, did not remember the records. They did not remember the edicts issued from distant castles demanding grain tithes on harvests that no longer existed, the ink still drying on parchment while the fields they referenced had already drowned. What they remembered, what lived in the body long after the mind had tried to soften it, was this smell. The smell of loss arriving before loss itself had fully crossed the threshold. The smell of a world changing its mind about its promises. Along the banks of a slow Flemish river, in a village whose name has dissolved into the general silence of unrecorded lives, there was a mill. It was not a grand structure. The walls were timber and daub, patched in 3 places where the winter floods of previous decades had pressed against the lower courses and demanded accommodation. The great wheel that turned in the current had been repaired so many times that almost none of its original timber remained. It was a wheel held together by memory and maintenance, by the accumulated knowledge of the man who tended it and the man who had tended it before him and the man before that, each one passing down not only the craft but the understanding that a mill is never finished, only ever in the process of being kept alive. The miller was a broad man, not tall, with forearms that spoke of decades of work and hands that had been calloused so long the calluses had become simply skin. His identity, the deep, structural part of it, the part that told him each morning who he was and what his life meant, was bound entirely to abundance. Not his own abundance. The village's. He was the man through whose stones the grain became flour, through whose hands the raw and the harvested passed into the sustaining. When a woman brought him a sack of wheat and left with a parcel of flour, something had been completed, some ancient transaction between the earth and the human body had been honored, and he was the instrument of that completion. He was necessary in the way that a key is necessary. Not the door, not the room beyond the door, but the turning mechanism between one world and the other. When the grain stopped coming, he did not know, at first, what he was. He stood inside his mill, inside the building that defined him, surrounded by the heavy, motionless machinery that had given his life its rhythm and its shape, and he listened to the millstones say nothing. The wheel still turned in the current outside. The mechanism still moved. But there was nothing to grind, and so the sound of the mill was the sound of purposeful motion in service of an absence, which is not a sound that a man can hear indefinitely without something shifting inside him. He would run his palm along the grooves carved into that cold gray stone. Long shallow channels, worn smooth in the years of his own tenure, but cut originally by his father's chisel, his father's hands. He knew every variation in those grooves. He knew where the stone was slightly harder, where it gave a little differently under the grain. And the silence that came back to him now, as his hand moved across the surface and found nothing waiting, felt not mechanical but personal. As though the stone itself had withdrawn its willingness. As though it, too, was waiting for something the sky had not seen fit to provide. He began to do what many did in those years, in villages across the shivering breadth of northern Europe. He began to ration not just food, but meaning. He told himself the rains would relent. He had lived through wet seasons before. One bad harvest, even two, was not unknown to a man of his years. The earth had its moods, as any farmer or miller could tell you, and moods passed. He told himself that God was testing them the way he had tested the Israelites in the wilderness, stripping away comfort, stripping away surplus, removing everything that was merely convenient so that something deeper and more essential might be revealed underneath. He had heard this interpretation from the pulpit more than once in the preceding months, and he chose to believe it not because it satisfied him intellectually, but because the alternative, that this was simply weather, simply the indifferent machinery of a sky that recognized no covenant with the people beneath it, was a thought he could not hold without something inside him breaking irreparably. He was not a man given to prayer. He had gone to Mass his entire life because Mass was what you did, the way you paid your tithes and observed the feast days and kept the rhythms that held a community together. But prayer, the private, interior kind, the kind that required a genuine belief in an audience, had never come naturally to him. It came now. In the mornings, before his wife woke, before the children stirred in their corner of the cottage, he would rise in the dark and walk the short distance to the mill and kneel on the cold stone floor. Not on the soft earth outside. Not in the church where such gestures were performed in community and witnessed. Alone, on stone, in the dark, with the empty millstone above him and the sound of the wheel turning in a current that carried no grain. He would press his forehead to the floor with the fervor of a man who does not know whether he believes but has concluded, in the arithmetic of desperation, that he cannot afford not to. What no priest in that village had the courage to say to him, what perhaps no priest in any village had the courage to say, that long winter, to the people who pressed into cold stone naves with frost on their cloaks and hunger in their eyes and the unspoken hope that the institution of faith would have some answer for the institution of starvation, was simply this. Faith and grain are not the same thing. Prayer could hold a family together in its love, in its shared endurance, in the invisible architecture of meaning that human beings require in order to survive not just physically but as themselves. But prayer could not stop a body from consuming its own reserves, could not keep ribs from becoming visible beneath linen shirts. could not prevent the particular brightness that entered the eyes of the severely malnourished, that strange, terrible luminosity that was not hope and was not peace, but was the body's last generous act before it began, quietly and systematically, to devour itself. His youngest son stopped growing that winter. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone could stand before and point to and say, "Here, this is the moment, this is where the line was crossed." Children grow unevenly at the best of times. They pause and surge, obeying rhythms that parents track in door frames and in the hems of tunics, let down and let down again to accommodate a body becoming itself. But this was different. This was a stillness that went beyond the body. The boy, he was perhaps 5 years old, perhaps 6, small enough that his age had never been precisely recorded anywhere, had stopped in a way that the miller recognized without being able to name, the way you recognize a sound you have never heard before but understand instantly to be wrong. He was present. He breathed. He watched the world with eyes that were still curious, still capable of lighting when the dog moved across the floor or when his mother spoke to him gently. But something in him had paused. Something that should have been in motion had grown very still, the way water grows still just before it begins to freeze. The miller looked at his son and understood, somewhere below the reach of language, that he was watching the future ration itself. That the body, in its ancient and unsentimental wisdom, had begun to decide what it could afford and what it could not, what it would protect and what it would defer. And he understood, though he would not say this aloud for years, and perhaps never said it at all, that no prayer he had pressed into the cold stone floor of his mill in the pre-dawn dark had prevented this, had slowed it, had bargained with it. The wheel turned outside in the current, purposeful and empty. The millstone waited. And somewhere in the village, other children were growing still in the same way, small bodies making their own calculations, arriving at their own economies of survival. The miller's faith did not shatter that winter. It simply grew very quiet. The way grain fields grow quiet. The way a village square grows quiet. The way everything grows quiet when the world has withdrawn something essential and not yet indicated whether, or when, it intends to return. That question, whether return was possible and what form it might take, and what a community might be willing to do in the space between loss and restoration, would not be answered by prayer alone. It would require something older, something that lived not in churches but in the gathered instinct of people who had decided, without meeting to discuss it, that they would face what was coming together. How they organized that facing, what they sacrificed, what they protected, and what they discovered about each other in the depths of a hunger that showed no signs of relenting, is what this story must now enter. There is a moment that arrives in every prolonged catastrophe, not announced, not marked by any outward sign, when survival stops being an emergency and becomes simply a life. The body, in its ancient and unsentimental intelligence, is the first to understand this. It stops sending the signals it once sent. The sharp insistence of hunger, that urgent, demanding voice that once said this is wrong, this must be corrected, attend to this immediately, that voice grows quieter. Not satisfied. Never satisfied. But quieter, the way a prisoner grows quieter after a long time, not because the walls have changed but because the self has reorganized around the fact of them. The ache in the stomach becomes less a message and more a climate. Something you wake into rather than something that wakes you. Something you carry the way you carry the cold, not with alarm, but with the grim, practiced accommodation of a person who has learned that the temperature is not going to change and the coat is not going to get any thicker. This is the negotiation. The terrible, invisible negotiation between the body and the mind that happens not in a single moment but across many small surrenders, across mornings where the decision not to panic is made again before the eyes have fully opened. Those who have never been truly hungry tend to imagine it as a state of constant, screaming urgency. Those who have lived inside it know that urgency eventually exhausts itself, and what remains is something quieter and in some ways more frightening, not the emergency of hunger, but the normalcy of it. In the village of St. Lo, in the Norman countryside where the hills unroll toward the sea with a gentleness that seems, in the memory of those years, almost cruel in its beauty, this negotiation was completed sometime in the second winter. By then, The village had already traveled a great distance from the people it had been. The livestock were gone. Not all at once. There had been, in the first months of shortage, fierce internal debates about the animals, conducted not in the village square but in the private anguish of individual families, in the space between a man looking at his ox and his ox looking back at him with the patient blankness of an animal that does not know it is being considered as a meal. The ox represented next year's plowing. The ox represented the future in its most practical form. The ability to turn soil, to plant, to repeat the cycle that constituted survival. To eat the ox was to eat the future. They ate the ox, and then the pig, and then the goat, and then the dog, and then what the dog had been eating, and then what remained after that. They had ground acorn flour, a task of enormous labor that produced a paste tasting of nothing, gritty and astringent, that filled the stomach the way a stone fills a purse, not with value but with the sensation of fullness, briefly, before the emptiness returned angrier and more insistent than before. They had boiled leather strips in water and drunk the resulting liquid because the body will extract meaning from almost anything if the alternative is to extract nothing at all. They had stripped bark from trees, from the birch trees at the forest edge, from the young elms whose inner bark, softened in water and dried, could be ground into a powder that was not food but was not entirely not food either. They fed what they had to the children first. This is the law that requires no writing, no counsel, no enforcement. In a community under sufficient pressure, it operates as purely as gravity. The children ate first when there was almost enough. They were protected last when there was almost nothing. And the parents who enacted this law did so without heroism, without the language of sacrifice. They did it the way you breathe, because the alternative was inconceivable, because there are things the body refuses on behalf of the heart even when the mind might, in its darkest hours, consider otherwise. It was the women of St. Lo who understood first that individual survival and collective survival were no longer the same calculation. They organized themselves the way women in crisis have always organized, without announcement, without authority granted from above, without any structure that a lord or a priest or a chronicler would have recognized as governance. There was no morning meeting, no vote, no declaration. There was only the gray hour before dawn when three of the older women, their names unrecorded, their faces unknown to history, their intelligence and courage belonging entirely to the silence of the unwritten, rose from their sleeping families and began to move between households, carrying a single iron pot and a cloth sack containing whatever had been found, salvaged, foraged, or quietly surrendered by those who understood what was being attempted. The unspoken agreement that traveled with them between doors was both ancient and radical. What belongs to one belongs now to all. Not as an ideology, not as a philosophy of commons to be debated in the firelight, but as a simple, pragmatic recognition that the arithmetic of individual households no longer worked, and the only arithmetic that had any chance of keeping people alive was the arithmetic of the collective. 10 families sharing one pot of thin bark broth survive longer than 10 families hoarding 10 separate insufficiencies. The mathematics were not complicated. The human cost of accepting them, the surrendering of the instinct to protect your own, to keep what little you have against the need you know is coming, that was the part that required something beyond calculation, that required trust. And trust, in the second winter of a famine, was not a small thing to ask. This was not charity. The word charity contains within it the assumption of surplus. Someone who has enough, giving some of what is extra to someone who has less. There was no surplus in St. Lo that winter. There was only shared depletion, shared endurance, the ancient decision of a community under siege to face its extinction collectively rather than die alone in the slightly longer privacy of individual households. A young woman named Emily knew all of this. She understood the collective. She participated in it, carried the pot, contributed what she had, sat with the older women in the cold and worked through the grim daily mathematics of distribution. And she kept a secret. Beneath the earthen floor of her cottage, under the corner where the hearthstones met the wall, she had buried a small clay jar. In it, the last of her dried rosemary, its scent faded now but still present, still a ghost of the summer that had produced it. A handful of dried lentils she had set aside in early autumn, before the worst of it, with the instinct of a creature that senses winter coming before winter has announced itself. And 3 small coins, silver, worn thin, earned the previous September by mending the traveling coat of a Flemish merchant who had passed through the village and paid her fairly, not knowing or perhaps not caring that fairness in that season was an act of unknowing generosity. She had told no one about the jar. Not her husband, who slept 3 feet from the place where it was buried. Not her mother. Not the older women she worked alongside each dawn. Not from greed. Emmeline was not a greedy woman, and anyone who had watched her divide what little she had would have understood that immediately. But from the particular, hard-earned wisdom of women who have lived close enough to the bottom to know what it looks like, who have learned, in the bone-deep way that experience teaches what instruction cannot, to hold something back. To keep one thing in reserve. To maintain, somewhere beneath the public face of shared sacrifice, a private last resort, not for luxury, not even for comfort, but for the moment when everything else is gone and something, anything, must remain. Every night before she slept, she reached down and pressed her palm flat against the floor where the jar was buried. She did not open it. She did not count the lentils or smell the rosemary or handle the coins. She simply felt the slight unevenness of the earth above the jar and let the knowledge of it travel up through her hand and into the part of her that most needed steadying. It was there. She had not yet used the last of everything. Somewhere beneath the cold floor of her hunger, there was still a tomorrow she had quietly, stubbornly, defiantly prepared for. Not a grand tomorrow. Not a tomorrow of abundance or restoration or the righting of what had gone so terribly wrong. Only a tomorrow. One more day in which she would still have something, however small, that the famine had not yet reached. What she could not know, lying there in the dark with her palm against the floor, was that the women moving through the village at dawn, the collective she had joined, the shared pot she had helped to carry, were also a kind of jar buried beneath a floor. A reserve of a different type. The last resource a community holds when all the others have been exhausted. Not food. Not coin. Not rosemary. Each other. And that resource, unlike the lentils, unlike the coins, unlike everything else the famine had methodically consumed, that resource had not yet been depleted. Not entirely. Not yet. But the men who held the ledgers and the power were about to arrive and test it. He had memorized the weight of 11 bodies. This is not something a man intends to learn. It accumulates the way all unwanted knowledge accumulates, through repetition, through the hands, through the particular intimacy of lifting what was once a person and carrying it to the place where persons are returned to the earth. A grave in winter is a difficult thing. The ground in the Norman countryside during those years of unrelenting cold and wet did not surrender itself easily. It had to be argued with, broken open with iron implements by men who had little strength left for argument. And yet the graves were dug, because the alternative, the unburied dead, the bodies left to the cold and the animals and the particular horror of visibility, was something the village was not yet ready to accept. Not yet. There were things they were still protecting. Dignities they had not yet been forced to abandon. He had buried 11 people since Michaelmas. 3 of them were children, whose shrouds were the most unbearable to prepare because the cloth required was so small, because small cloth somehow communicates loss in a way that large cloth cannot, because the body of a child wrapped for burial occupies a space in the world that the mind refuses to accept as final. One of them was a man of perhaps 60 who had simply stopped eating, had stopped with a completeness and a deliberateness that his family understood but could not acknowledge aloud, because to acknowledge it was to name a thing they were not ready to name. And one of them was a young mother who had given birth to a living child and then, sometime in the dark hours of the following night, had made, or been made, the decision not to remain. Her body, when he had come to prepare it, had been so entirely reduced by the preceding months that lifting her felt like lifting something unfinished, like carrying a coat that had lost its person. He had stood with her weight, her almost absence, in his arms and felt something shift in him that he could not subsequently shift back. The priest's name has not survived. He exists in no chronicle, no episcopal record, no letter of complaint to the Bishop of Bayeux about conditions in the parish. He is entirely invisible to history, which is perhaps fitting, because invisibility was the central experience of his second year of famine, not the invisibility of the forgotten, but the invisibility of a man who must be seen by others as something he is no longer certain he is. Every morning, they came to him, thin, wide-eyed, their breath making small clouds in the frozen air outside the church door, their lips already forming the words before he had fully opened it. "Pray for us, Father. Intercede for us. Tell us when it will end." They were not asking him to feed them. They understood, most of them by now, that the church had as little as everyone else, that the tallow candles had been cut to half their usual length to make them last, that the incense that should have filled the nave with its particular sacred smoke had run out before Christmas and had not been replaced because replacement required coin and coin required commerce and commerce required roads and roads required travelers and travelers required safety and safety required a world that was, in every practical sense, not the one they were currently inhabiting. They were not asking for bread. They were asking for something harder to provide and easier to pretend to provide. They were asking for meaning, for the assurance that what was happening to them was legible within a framework that had a resolution, that it was a test, a trial, a chapter in a larger story being authored by a will that intended eventual mercy even if mercy was not yet visible. They were asking him to be the man who knew this, the man through whom the vertical relationship between a suffering people and an attending God was maintained and guaranteed. He brought them inside, into the cold stone nave that smelled of damp wool and the particular unwashed warmth of bodies that had stopped expecting comfort, and he opened his mouth and said the words. The words were not lies, exactly. They were inherited architecture, structures built by generations of faith before him, maintained by repetition, made meaningful by the accumulated weight of all the people who had spoken and believed them. He stood inside those structures the way a man stands inside a building whose foundations he is no longer certain of, carefully, without jumping, without making any movement that might test what he has begun to suspect. Alone, at night, the performance ended. There was no light to spare for the altar. The tallow was rationed now as strictly as the grain had once been rationed, each small act of illumination calculated against all the other acts it might prevent. He knelt in total darkness. Therefore, before a God he could not see in a church he could barely feel the edges of, and he pressed his palms flat against the stone floor and stayed very still. He did not ask why. He had asked that question. Everyone asks that question. It is the first and most human question. It is the question that contains within it the assumption of an author who can be held responsible, and he had found it insufficient, unsatisfying not because it went unanswered, but because the asking of it had revealed something about himself he was not prepared for, that it was a child's question, and he was no longer a child, and he could not pretend to the innocence that the question required. His question, in the dark, pressing his palms into the cold stone as though he might feel something answer through the floor, was quieter, more exposed, more dangerous. Are you watching? Not, why are you doing this? But, are you present at all? Are you here in this darkness, in this cold, in this village where the children have stopped growing and the mothers are dying of a poverty so complete it has become indistinguishable from erasure? Are you looking at what is happening to these people who come to my door each morning and ask me to be the instrument of your attention? Or have you, like the saints in the window above the altar, turned your gaze to somewhere else? The saints in that window were old. The window itself was the oldest thing in the village. Romanesque glass set into Romanesque stone, pressed into lead by hands that had been dust for 2 centuries, depicting figures whose serene and upturned faces had been designed in a season of abundance by a craftsman who believed in what he was making. The priest would look at those faces during the day when thin winter light fell through them, pale, exhausted light that had traveled a long way and spent most of itself in the process, and he would think about that craftsman. Would try to enter the imagination of a man who had stood in this same nave 200 years ago, in a different world, and pressed colored glass into lead channels with the deliberate care of someone creating something meant to outlast his own understanding of it. Had that craftsman, in his season of faith and craft and presumably sufficient bread, ever looked at the faces he was creating and imagined them being looked at in a winter like this one? Had he designed those gently averted eyes intentionally, that slight, serene angle of the gaze that meant the saints were looking not at the congregation below them but at something beyond, something above and away, or had it simply been the style, the convention, the aesthetic of his era and his training? The priest could no longer tell the difference. He would kneel in the dark until his knees ached against the stone, until the cold had moved from the floor through his body and settled somewhere near the center of him, and then he would rise and walk to the door of the church and stand for a moment looking out at the village. The dark shapes of cottages, the bare trees, the particular silence of a community that has run out of the energy required for audible suffering and has passed into something quieter and more internal. He was still their priest. He would open the door again tomorrow. He would say the words again. He would be, for those who came to him, the man who knew. But in the long space between closing the door at night and opening it again in the morning, he was only a man in a dark building, pressing his hands against a cold floor, asking a question that the silence answered by remaining entirely and mercilessly itself. What the priest did not know, what he could not have seen from inside his particular darkness, was that the village was not waiting for an answer from above. It had already, quietly and without theological consultation, begun to construct its own. The women moving between households before dawn with their iron pot and their shared inventory were not waiting for divine intervention. The boy at the forest edge filling his basket with bark and sorrel was not waiting for a miracle to make the fields productive again. Emmeline, with her hand pressed to the floor above her buried jar, was not waiting for God to tell her the hunger was over. They were deciding. Each morning, in small and unrecorded ways, they were making the only choice that remained available to a people from whom every other choice had been stripped: to organize, to share, to act as though tomorrow was worth preparing for, even when every available evidence suggested that tomorrow would be another version of today. But there was a force that even this collective determination had not yet encountered fully. A force that arrived on horseback, with ledgers, with the authority of a distant lord who had not missed a meal that winter and was not inclined to begin. The accounting was coming. And the village, which had spent 2 winters learning how to survive each other's hunger, was about to learn whether it could survive someone else's indifference. He was awake before the village. This was not unusual. In the second winter of the famine, sleep had become a shallow and unreliable country. People entered it exhausted and left it unrestored, as though the body, even in unconsciousness, could not fully release its vigil. But the boy woke differently from the adults. He woke with a quality of attention that had no anxiety in it, only direction. He would open his eyes in the gray pre-dawn dark of the cottage, listen for a moment to the breathing of his family around him, his mother's slow exhale, his younger sister's small, irregular rhythm, his father's silence, which was the silence of a man who has learned to be very still so as not to require more than he is given, and then he would rise. He dressed without sound. The rough wool tunic, stiff with cold. The leather shoes, cracked at the left toe, too small now by almost a full finger's width, so that walking any distance meant the particular intimacy of discomfort that children in those years wore as simply and unself-consciously as they wore everything else. A small basket, woven from river reed, light enough to carry in one hand. And then the door, lifted slightly as it opened to prevent the scrape of wood against the threshold that would wake his mother. And then the cold air of the Norman morning, and the path, and the half-mile of frozen mud that led to the tree line. He walked it the way he had learned to walk everything in those months, close to the ground, eyes moving. Not with fear, though the forest at the edge of dawn held real dangers for a child alone. Wolves still moved through those trees in the famine years, drawn closer to human settlement by the same logic that drove everything closer to everything in times of scarcity. He walked it with the specific, calibrated alertness of a creature that has learned to read the world at the level where sustenance actually exists. Not above, not in the sky or the branches or the promises of adults, but below. At root level. At moss level. At the level of things that live in the cold and the dark and the wet and do not require the cooperation of the sky to continue. His name has not survived. In the records that exist, the parish registers, the manor rolls, the occasional letter in which a cleric describes conditions in a particular region with the detached precision of a man writing about whether in a country he has never visited, children like him do not appear. They were not yet taxpayers. They were not yet tenants. They held no land, owed no tithes, owed no military service to any lord. In the accounting of the medieval world, they were not yet legible. And so we call him Thomas, or Tomas, or perhaps something entirely different, a name spoken in the Norman dialect of his village, worn smooth by the mouths of people who loved him, and now entirely gone. What has survived is what he knew. He knew that wood sorrel grew under the oak roots on the north-facing slope, in the places where the frost came last and left first, where the soil held a particular dark moisture that the sorrel required. It had a sharp, clean taste, almost lemony, startling in its brightness against the gray palette of everything else that winter offered, and it could be eaten raw or bruised into water to make a liquid that tasted of something, which was already more than most things tasted of by February. He knew which mosses were edible and which were not. This knowledge had been acquired the hard way, through the particular curriculum of trial and consequence that hunger administers without mercy or apology. A morning of stomach cramps and cold sweating against a tree trunk had taught him more precisely than any instruction could have. He had learned from his own body, which had become, in those months, his most reliable teacher. He knew that the inner bark of birch trees, scraped from the younger trunks before the frost sealed it, dried in whatever thin sunlight offered itself, powdered between two flat stones, could be mixed into hot water to produce something that was not food in any strict sense, but was not nothing either. It coated the stomach. It quieted the complaints of a body that had been filing the same urgent petition for weeks and was beginning to understand that the petition would not be answered in the manner requested, only in the manner available. He knew where the hibernating beetles gathered in the root hollows of the old elms. He knew which berries had dried on the branch rather than rotting, small, wizened, with a concentrated sweetness that hit the tongue like a memory of abundance, and which looked the same but had gone to poison. He knew the difference between the mushrooms that nourished and the mushrooms that killed, a distinction that is not as simple as the comfortable assume and that had cost, in villages less fortunate than his, children who had not yet learned to read the subtle language of spore and gill and color that the forest speaks in its own register. All of this knowledge he carried in his 11-year-old body like a second skeleton, like an architecture built not from bone but from attention. Every morning he brought back what he found, and every morning he gave it entirely away. This is the fact about him that resists easy interpretation. He was not a saint. He stole dried peas from the communal store on at least 3 occasions when he was certain no one was watching, and on one of those occasions he was not as unobserved as he believed, and the woman who saw him said nothing, which was its own kind of grace. He was a child, fully and ordinarily, capable of selfishness and small deceptions and the ordinary moral failures of a person who is hungry and young and still in the process of becoming whatever he would eventually become. But he shared the basket. Every morning, without ceremony, without the language of sacrifice or the performance of virtue. He shared it because the village was the unit of his world, and the unit of his world was hungry, and he was a part of it. You did not feed one part of an organism and leave another part to fail. This was not philosophy. It was not even precisely generosity. It was the logic of belonging, the understanding absorbed so early and so completely that it had become structural, that his life and the lives around him were not separate accounts but a single ledger, and the only arithmetic that made sense was the arithmetic of the whole. The basket he brought back each morning was never enough. It was always, in the strict calculation of calories and survival, insufficient. Sorrel and bark powder and dried berries, and, on one remarkable morning, a nest of hibernating beetles that were accepted without comment and tipped into the communal pot by the older women with the same equanimity they brought to everything. These things could not substitute for grain, could not replace the harvest that the rains had taken, could not undo the damage that 2 winters of systemic shortage had done to bodies already reduced to their essentials. But they were something. And in those years, in the Norman countryside and the Flemish lowlands and the frost-bitten parishes of the Rhineland, in every village where people were daily negotiating the distance between almost nothing and nothing at all, something was not a small word. Something was the difference between a family that endured and a family that became a name scratched hastily into the margin of a parish register by a priest who had run out of room in the main text, a name that would fade within a generation and be entirely gone within 2, leaving behind no trace, No memory, no evidence that these particular people had ever stood in this particular place and tried. What the boy carried back to the village in his reed basket each morning was more than food. It was proof. Daily, renewed, empirical proof that the world still contained things that could sustain life. That the forest, for all its cold indifference, had not entirely closed its hand. That if you woke early enough and walked far enough into the dark and lowered yourself to the level of the ground, to the level where life actually persisted, quiet and unheroic and stubbornly present beneath the ruined surface of everything, the earth would give you something. The adults watched him go each morning and return each afternoon, and something in the watching changed them in ways they could not have articulated. It was not hope, exactly. Hope requires a future tense, a belief in the possibility of restoration, and many of them had, by the second winter, suspended their relationship with the future tense in the same way they had suspended their relationship with abundance, not forever, but for now, as a protection against the repeated injury of expectation. What the boy gave them was not hope but evidence. Not a promise but a practice. The daily fact of his going and returning, of his basket always containing something, of his consistent refusal to accept the completeness of the depletion, this was its own kind of sustenance, feeding something in them that the bark broth could not reach. And yet the boy could not protect them from what was coming on horseback. He could read the forest. He could read the mosses and the bark and the root hollows where the beetles slept. But he could not read the language of parchment and seal and the particular authority of a man who arrived from outside the logic of the village entirely, carrying in his brass-fitted saddlebag an account of what was owed that bore no relationship to the account of what existed. That man was already on the road. And the village that had learned, through 2 winters of shared hunger and daily small salvage, to survive the indifference of the sky was about to discover whether it could survive the attentions of a system that had never, in its design or its intention, included them in its calculations as anything other than a source of revenue. The accounting was no longer coming. It had arrived. He arrived on a gray morning in February, when the snow had transformed the fields into a vast and silent erasure. Not the dramatic snow of illuminated manuscripts and remembered winters, not the kind that falls in great soft curtains and makes the world briefly beautiful before it becomes a burden. This was the snow of the second year of famine. Flat, compacted, dirty at its edges where the wind had pushed it against the foundations of cottages and the bases of the bare trees, gray-white and indifferent, covering the ground the way a document covers the thing it is written over. Hiding it, claiming it, making it into something that could be read by those with the right education and ignored entirely by those without. He came through it on horseback, alone except for a single servant riding behind him, and the sound of hooves on the frozen road reached the village before he did. The children heard it first. There were still children who listened for sounds from the road, children whose alertness to the outside world had been sharpened, rather than dulled, by 2 winters of scarcity. They did not run toward the sound. They had learned, by then, not to run toward things until the nature of those things was established. They watched from doorways, still and careful, their breath making small clouds in the cold, their eyes carrying that particular calculation that hungry children develop, the rapid, unsentimental assessment of what an approaching thing might mean for them. What it meant was this: the accounting had arrived. He was not a cruel man. This is the first and most important thing to understand about him, because it is the most uncomfortable thing, and the most true. The comfortable cruelties of history are the easy ones to comprehend. The cold-eyed villain, the indifferent oppressor, the man who looks at suffering and feels nothing, who has organized his interior life around the convenience of not knowing. That man is a simple man to explain and a simple man to condemn, and his simplicity offers a certain relief to those of us who wish the story of human suffering to have a clear architecture of guilt. The steward was not that man. He was a tired man of perhaps 40 years, with the weathered face of someone who has spent the better part of his adult life on horseback in all weathers, moving between the estates of a lord who preferred to remain in his hall and required someone else to move through the world on his behalf. His cloak was good wool, lined with rabbit fur, not the fur of nobility, not ermine or sable, but the honest fur of a man of middling position who had earned a middling comfort and wore it without display. His hands, when he removed his riding gloves in the doorway of the village hall, were chapped from the cold and ink-stained at the right forefinger, the permanent mark of a man whose life is constituted largely of writing things down. He had packed his own lunch that morning: salt pork, hard cheese, a heel of bread, and he had eaten it on the road, alone, before entering the village. Not because he had been instructed to, not because any code of law or lordship required this consideration, but because he was not a cruel man, and not a stupid one, and he understood, in the practical and inarticulate way that such understandings arrive, that to eat in front of people who have not eaten, to produce food from a saddlebag and consume it in the presence of people whose bodies have been in negotiation with absence for 2 years, would be an act of violence that no professional necessity could justify. So he ate on the road, in the cold, alone, and arrived empty-handed and deliberately ungrateful, which was perhaps the most decent thing he did that day, and which no one ever knew about. The reeve of the village met him at the door. The reeve was the hinge between two worlds, the world of the Lord's accounting and the world of the village's living, and he had been turning in that hinge for the better part of 2 years with a grinding persistence that had cost him most of his hair and, by the evidence of his face, most of his sleep. He was a lean man, made leaner by the winter, with the particular posture of someone who has been carrying weight that has no physical form. The weight of being the person through whom bad news must pass in both directions, the person responsible to everyone and protected by no one, the person whose authority rests entirely on the trust of the people he represents and who cannot exercise that authority without, in some fundamental sense, betraying it. He had rehearsed this meeting many times in the dark of his sleepless nights. He had the numbers. He had assembled them with meticulous care, checking and rechecking, building the evidence of the village's depletion into a structure so precise and so complete that no reasonable man, confronted with it, could dispute its conclusions. He knew what the grain stores held, which was almost nothing. He knew what the livestock tallies showed, which was the evidence of a community that had consumed its own productive future in order to survive its present. He knew the count of the dead, the count of the living, the count of the fields that had yielded nothing, and the count of those that might, if the spring was merciful and the summer dry, yield something again. Though even this optimism was theoretical, constructed from hope rather than evidence, because the reeve also knew what 2 years of wet and cold had done to seed stock, to soil, to the animals that turned the soil, to the people who tended the animals. He had the numbers. What he did not have, what no reeve in any starving village in 14th century Europe had, was any power over what those numbers meant within a system that had been designed for abundance and had never, in its design or its philosophy or its deepest structural assumptions, imagined the sustained, systemic failure of the abundance on which it depended. The system was built to extract. In good years, the extraction left enough behind. In these years, the extraction was being performed on a body that had nothing left to give, and the system had no language for this, no procedure, no mechanism of adjustment that could accommodate the simple and devastating truth that you cannot take a percentage of nothing and call it a levy. They sat in the hall. The steward opened his ledger. He asked the questions he was required to ask, in the order he was required to ask them, with the professional neutrality of a man who has learned to separate the content of what he is recording from the human reality it represents, because to collapse that separation, to feel fully and simultaneously both the weight of the numbers and the weight of the people behind them, would make the work impossible. And the work, whatever its moral complications, was his life, and he was going to continue living it. The reeve answered. His voice was steady. He had rehearsed this. He spoke with the careful, exhausted precision of a man who has decided that the only power he has in this room is the power of accuracy, that if he cannot change the outcome, he can at least ensure that the outcome is arrived at through a complete and honest accounting of what is, rather than an optimistic projection of what the ledger wished were true. The scratching of the quill against parchment was, for a long time, the loudest sound in the hall. Outside, the snow held its silence. Inside, a village's suffering was being transcribed into a document that would outlast every person in the room, that would survive in an archive somewhere, dry and preserved, long after the reeve and the steward and every man, woman, and child whose lives it described had returned to the earth. The steward took a reduced levy, less than the full amount owed, more than the village could honestly bear. This was, within the constraints of a system that had not authorized him to take nothing, the best he could do. It was not enough. It was also not nothing, and in a world structured as this one was, in a world where the relationship between the starving and the powerful was mediated entirely by men like him, carrying ledgers on horseback through February snow, not nothing was what passed for mercy. He did not look back when he rode away. The village watched him go from doorways and from the edges of fields, the same still, careful watching with which it had greeted his arrival. The hoofbeats diminished. The road absorbed him. The snow, undisturbed in his wake, settled back into its silence. The reeve stood in the doorway of the hall for a long time after the sound had entirely disappeared, holding the accounting of what remained. It was less than what had been there that morning. It was more than nothing. He had been a reeve for 11 years. He had navigated disputes over field boundaries, brokered agreements between difficult men, carried the Lord's instructions to people who did not want to receive them, and carried the people's grievances to a Lord who did not want to hear them. He had, in all that time, believed that the position he occupied, uncomfortable, unglamorous, requiring the daily sacrifice of ease for the sake of function, was nevertheless a position of consequence. That the hinge mattered, that the turning of it, done carefully and with integrity, was the thing that kept the two worlds from crushing each other entirely. He was no longer entirely certain this was true, but the spring was coming, perhaps. If the sky could be persuaded to remember its obligations, if the seed that remained was sufficient, if the bodies that had survived the winter had enough left in them to plant and tend and wait. That single syllable was the whole architecture of the season ahead, a conditional structure built on the accumulated if of 100 small desperations, all of them waiting for the same answer from the same indifferent sky that had refused them for 2 years already. What they did not know, standing in their doorways watching the steward's hoofprints fill slowly with fresh snow, was that the answer was coming. Not as rescue, not as restoration, but as the slow, ambiguous return of a world that had been absent long enough to become a kind of miracle simply by arriving. The spring that would follow this winter would be its own kind of story, and it would begin, as all such stories begin, not with joy, but with the cautious, half-believing act of kneeling in the cold earth and pressing a seed into the ground, and waiting to see if the ground was still willing to receive it. The snow did not leave all at once. It retreated the way catastrophe retreats, not in a single merciful withdrawal, but in stages, each one provisional, each one requiring verification before it could be trusted. First from the south-facing slopes, where the pale winter sun reached longest and the earth was first to remember its obligations. Then from the edges of paths, where the compacted gray-white of 2 months' accumulations softened at its borders and began to darken and thin and finally resolve back into the mud it had always been underneath. Then, more slowly, from the fields, those wide, silent expanses that had been, for months, the most complete expression of the famine's logic, blank, featureless, offering nothing, covering everything, a landscape of enforced forgetting. And then, in the black and waterlogged soil of those fields, something green. It came the way all genuine miracles come, quietly, without announcement, without the drama that the magnitude of the moment seemed to demand. A thread of green at the base of a fence post. A soft uprising at the edge of a ditch where the drainage was better than elsewhere. Moss, first, and then something more deliberate. The first tentative arrowheads of new growth pushing up through the dark earth with the unhurried confidence of life that has simply been waiting for the conditions to become marginally less hostile. Not welcoming, not warm, but marginally less hostile. Which was enough. People stood in their doorways and watched this greening. And those who have never been truly hungry, who have never stood on the far side of a winter that was not certain to end, might have looked at those faces and seen gratitude. Might have expected tears, embraces, the uncomplicated radiance of relief. But the faces in those doorways held something more complicated than gratitude and something harder one. They held a grieving alertness, the expression of people who have wanted something so long and so desperately that when it begins to arrive, the wanting does not simply dissolve. It remains present, vigilant, unable to release its watch. A hunger that had learned, through 2 winters of repeated disappointment, not to trust its own ending. They watched the green with the eyes of people who were not yet certain they were permitted to believe in it. The dead lay in rows at the edge of the churchyard. There had not been stone to mark them properly, no craftsman with the remaining strength to cut it, no surplus of material or time or the particular kind of communal energy that permanent memorialization requires. There were wooden stakes, driven into the cold ground at the head of each grave by the priest's own hands, cut from branches and shaped with a knife, bearing no inscription because inscription requires someone who can write and someone who has the leisure to do so, and those conditions had not obtained for a long time in this village. Just stakes. Just wood. Just the temporary notation of a community that had not yet been able to do better than temporary. The rain and frost would dissolve them within a season or two. The priest knew this. The families of the dead knew this. The ground itself, which receives without ceremony and holds without commentary, knew this in whatever way ground knows things, through the gradual work of moisture and time and the patient democracy of decomposition that makes no distinction between the marked and the unmarked, the remembered and the forgotten, the lives that were written down somewhere and the lives that were not. A woman came every morning to the stake that stood above her mother. She arrived before the other families, before the thin spring light had fully committed to the day, and she knelt in the wet earth and pressed her palm flat against the wood. She was not praying, exactly, or not only praying. She was learning the particular grain of this piece of wood the way she had once, over many years, learned her mother's face, the texture of it, the slight roughness, the places where the knife had left marks and the places where the weather had already begun its work of softening. She was committing it to the body rather than the mind, storing it in the hands where things are kept most reliably, because the hands remember even when the mind grows uncertain. She understood that the stake would not last. She understood that the ground would eventually become smooth and undifferentiated above this particular beloved absence. She was not trying to prevent this. She was trying to be present for as much of the remaining time as possible, to know this temporary marker as fully as the temporary time allowed, so that when the wood was gone and the earth was level and there was no longer any visible evidence of what lay beneath, she would still carry the knowledge of it in her palms. What the village rebuilt was not the village that had been. This is what famine does, in its aftermath, that is different from what war does and different from what plague does, though all three take people and leave structures behind. Famine is slower than war, less visible than plague, and its reconstruction demands a particular kind of reckoning with absence, the reckoning of people who must now inhabit a world that has been reshaped by subtraction, that has reorganized itself around holes, that requires them to live in the spaces between where things were and where things now are. Cottages were consolidated, two families into one structure, because one structure could be heated with less wood and tended with less labor, because the arithmetic of survival had permanently revised the arithmetic of privacy. Fields were redistributed, not by decree from above, not by any formal process of reallotment, but by the practical necessity of a community that no longer had enough people to work all the land it theoretically possessed, and understood that untended land was worse than reassigned land, and that the dead did not require acreage. New marriages were contracted, quickly, practically, with a directness that might have seemed indecent in other seasons, but in this one simply expressed the community's revised understanding of what marriage was for. It was not for inclination, not primarily inclination. Was a luxury that required surplus of time and emotional energy, both of which remained, in the early spring of recovery, in short supply. It was for labor and warmth and the tending of children who needed more adults than they currently had, and the maintenance of households that required more hands than any single person could provide. A widow of 26, with 2 children of her own, married a widower of 51 with 3. Not with love, not yet. Love was something that might grow in the space that shared endurance creates, and in some cases it did, and in some cases it did not, and both outcomes were understood as acceptable results of a bargain entered into for other reasons. They brought their 5 surviving children into a single household and organized it around the shared tending of one hearth, the shared working of 2 fields, the shared management of a winter's worth of firewood and whatever the spring planting might produce if the sky cooperated and the seed held and the bodies doing the work remained strong enough to do it. They did not speak much in those early months of slow recovery. Not because there was nothing to say, there was, in fact, almost too much to say, years of unsaid things accumulated in the compressed silence of survival, whole conversations that had been deferred indefinitely while more urgent negotiations occupied the available language. But language itself had been depleted along with everything else, worn thin by 2 years of being used primarily for necessity and rationing and the careful management of diminishing resources. What remained of it needed to be used with care, reserved for the communications that mattered most. Plant here, not there. The well water is clean again. The child is breathing better this morning. There is enough wood until Thursday. These sentences were not small. In the economy of a recovering village, they were enormous. They were the language of a community slowly, carefully, relearning the habit of a future tense, the grammatical structure that requires you to believe that Thursday will exist, that the week after this one is worth planning for, that the child who is breathing better this morning will continue to breathe and will require, therefore, consideration beyond the present moment. The Easter bells rang on a Sunday in late March, when the fields held their first genuine green and the mud in the village square had softened enough to take a footprint again. The priest rang them himself. He had thought, in January, standing in the dark of his church with his palms against the cold stone, about whether he still believed in what the bells announced: the resurrection, the return, the theological insistence that death is not the final grammar of the world. He had thought about this with the careful, bruised attention of a man who has been tested not by doubt alone but by evidence, by the specific and accumulating evidence of 11 graves and a winter that seemed constructed as an argument against mercy. He rang the bells anyway, not because the doubt had resolved. It hadn't, not entirely, perhaps not ever fully, but because the bells were not only for him. They were for the thin and blinking people who gathered in the mud outside the church door, who had lived through the same winter he had lived through and had arrived at the other side of it still present, still here, still capable of standing upright in the spring light and lifting their faces toward a sound they had not been certain, in January, that they would survive to hear. He rang the bells for them. For the woman who had learned her mother's wooden stake with her palms. For the miller whose youngest son had stopped growing and then, slowly, in the first weeks of warmth, had begun again. For the reeve who had sat across a table from a man with a ledger and protected what he could with the only weapon he had, which was precision. For the boy who had walked to the forest edge before dawn all winter and brought back what the forest was willing to give. For Emmeline, who had kept her jar, and who had finally opened it in February, finally, when it was truly necessary, and found it sufficient for one more week, which had been enough. The sound of the bells crossed the green fields and reached people standing in doorways and people kneeling in the mud beside wooden stakes and people pressing seeds into earth with hands that were still thin but were present, were here, were continuing. They listened to those bells the way you listen to something you had almost stopped believing in. Not with the uncomplicated joy of people who have been rescued. Not with the clean relief of those for whom the ending was always assumed. But with the trembling, half-disbelieving gratitude of the nearly lost, people standing at the very edge of a world that had considered, for a long time and with some seriousness, not continuing, and had then, in its own time and on its own terms, decided otherwise. The bells rang. The fields were green. The dead lay in rows beneath their dissolving stakes. And the living, thin and blinking in the spring light, turned their faces toward the sound and allowed themselves, carefully and with full knowledge of what such allowing costs, to begin again. Not because the world had been restored to what it was. It had not been and would not be, and they understood this with the clarity of people who have stood inside a loss large enough to permanently revise their understanding of what permanence means. But because the ground had accepted the seed, because the child was breathing, because the bell, against all the evidence of winter, was ringing, and because beginning again, not in hope, not in certainty, but in the stubborn, irreducible, deeply human refusal to accept silence as the final word, was the only story these people had ever known how to tell. It was the only story, in the end, that any of them had.